Picture this. The door to your sleeping quarters before you can reach for the sword leaning against the wall, rough hands drag you from your bed onto the cold floor. You're a French soldier stationed in Bruges, and the room is suddenly filled with men who smell of iron and raw wool. They are not knights, they are butchers and weavers, armed with axes still wet from the street outside. One of them, a giant of a man, grabs you by the hair, pulls your head back and places a heavy blade against your throat. He doesn't ask for money. He screams a single, incomprehensible phrase into your face. Shield and vriend. Shield and friend. Your life depends entirely on your accent. You stammer the words, but your French tongue stumbles over the harsh guttural vowels. The blade moves. The last thing you hear is the gurgle of your own blood joining the torrent already washing down the cobblestones. This brutal, intimate execution was the spark that ignited the Battle of the Golden Spurs, a conflict that would see the invincible knights of France butchered like cattle in the mud. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why shopkeepers were slaughtering soldiers at dawn on May 18th, 1302, we must strip away the romantic varnish of the Middle Ages, forget the chivalrous tournaments and courtly love. The reality of Flanders in the 14th century was a brutal racket of extortion and dominance. King Philip IV of France, ironically named Philip the Fair, viewed the wealthy cities of Flanders not as subjects to be governed, but as a vault to be looted. He needed gold to fund his endless wars, and the textile cities of Bruges and Ghent were overflowing with it. Philip didn't just tax them, he occupied them. He sent Jacques de Châtillon, a governor who ruled with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, to bring the Flemish to heel. Châtillon garrisoned French troops in private homes. Imagine the humiliation. Foreign soldiers eating your food, sleeping under your roof, and harassing your family, backed by the full military might of the French crown. The message was clear. You're not citizens, you're property. But Philip and Châtillon made a fatal miscalculation. They mistook the lack of noble titles for a lack of courage. They assumed that because these men worked with their hands dyeing wool, tanning leather, forging iron, they would not know how to fight. They were wrong. On that fateful morning, known as the Matins of Bruges, the city didn't just riot, it executed a meticulously planned purge. Peter de Koninck, a weaver with a talent for insurrection, had organized the guilds into death squads. They moved with terrifying efficiency. The target was every single Frenchman in the city. The Sheila and Friend Shibboleth was a masterstroke of urban warfare. In the pre-dawn chaos, uniforms meant nothing. The only way to identify the enemy was their tongue. The Flemish dialect requires a specific contortion of the throat that a native French speaker simply cannot mimic without practice. It was a linguistic death trap. As the sun rose, the bodies of 2,000 French soldiers and loyalists choked the canals. They were dragged from hiding spots, pulled from churches and butchered in the open. Châtillon himself barely escaped, fleeing in disguise while his garrison was systematically erased. This was not a battle. It was a message written in blood sent directly to Paris. When the news reached the French court, the shock was seismic. The peasantry had not just disobeyed, they had massacred the king's representatives. To the French nobility, this was an inversion of the natural order, as grotesque as sheep-eating wolves. The code of chivalry dictated that war was the sport of gentlemen, played by specific rules. The Flemish had just flipped the board. Philip the Fair's reaction was immediate and apocalyptic. He did not summon a diplomat. He summoned Robert of Artois. Robert was the quintessential French knight, brave, aggressive, and blinded by his own superiority. To him, the Flemish were a mob of rabbits that needed to be hunted down. He assembled a punitive force designed to crush the rebellion with overwhelming shock and awe. We are talking about the crème de la crème of European warfare. 2,500 noble knights and squires, supported by thousands of crossbowmen and infantry. These knights rode destriers, massive warhorses bred for impact, and wore the finest chainmail and plate armour money could buy. The objective was not just to retake Bruges, It was to inflict a punishment so severe that no commoner would dare look a knight in the eye for the next 100 years. Robert marched north, burning villages as he went, driving the refugees before him like cattle. The Flemish faced a grim calculus. They had enraged a superpower. They had no cavalry to match the French, no king to lead them, and no castles to hide in. Retreat meant execution. Surrender meant slavery. So, the army of rabbits did the unthinkable. They grabbed their pikes, their clubs, and their Goedendags, a weapon we will discuss shortly, and marched to the town of Courtrai. They looked at the geography, the river Lys, the marshy brooks, the deceptive green fields. They realized that if they couldn't beat the French knights in a fair fight, they would have to force them into an unfair one. Robert of Artois was coming to trample them, but the weavers and butchers of Flanders were preparing a kill-box. The stage was set for a clash that would shatter the spine of the French nobility. 200 miles south of the slaughter in Bruges, the atmosphere in the royal court of Paris was not one of fear. It was one of icy, murderous indignation. King Philip IV sat at the centre of a web of power that stretched across Christendom. They called him the Fair for his handsome features, but his contemporaries whispered that he was more statue than man, unblinking, silent, and utterly ruthless. To a monarch who believed his authority was divinely ordained, the massacre of his garrison was not a military setback. It was blasphemy. Philip did not rage. He calculated. The Flemish burghers had broken the social contract. In the medieval worldview, God ordained the nobility to fight and rule, the clergy to pray, and the peasantry to work and obey. By raising their hands against knights, the weavers of Bruges had threatened the very foundation of civilization. If a fuller could kill a count and get away with it, the crowns of every monarch in Europe would sit a little looser. The king's response was to unleash the full weight of the French state. He authorized the call to arms, summoning the feudal levy. From the vineyards of Burgundy to the plains of Normandy, messengers rode out with the royal seal. The command was simple: assemble. What gathered under the banner of the golden fleur-de-lis was the terrifying apex of medieval military technology. We often think of medieval armies as disorganized mobs, but the force Philip assembled was a precision instrument of violence. At its heart rode the French knights, the heavy cavalry. Understand what a knight represented in 1302. This was not merely a soldier, he was a human tank. A fully armoured knight on a destrier warhorse was the ultimate weapon of the age. The horse alone cost the equivalent of a peasant's lifetime wages, a massive beast bred for aggression and weight, capable of trampling a man to pulp without breaking stride. The rider was encased in mail, reinforced with early plate armour, a fortress of steel that made him virtually invulnerable to the weapons of the lower classes. When 2,000 of these riders charged in unison, they generated a kinetic energy that could shatter infantry formations through sheer impact. For 3 centuries, they had been the undisputed masters of the battlefield. Commanding this punitive expedition was Robert of Artois. If Philip was the cold intellect of France, Robert was its fiery sword. A prince of the blood and a seasoned veteran, Robert was the living embodiment of chivalry. He was brave, dashing, and spectacularly arrogant. He viewed the upcoming campaign not as a war, but as a disciplinary action. In his mind, he wasn't marching to fight an army. He was marching to whip rebellious dogs. Robert's attitude trickled down through the ranks. As the French host began its march north, a carnival atmosphere prevailed. The knights packed their finest silks and velvets alongside their swords. They brought their hunting falcons and their hounds. They fully expected the dirty Flemish rabbits to scatter at the first sight of a royal banner. The idea that a militia of shopkeepers could stand against the flower of French nobility was laughable. It was a mathematical impossibility in their eyes. But Robert of Artois made sure the march itself was a punishment. As the French army crossed into Flanders, they initiated a scorched earth policy. They didn't just forage for food, they burned what they couldn't carry. Villages were torched, crops were trampled, anyone found on the road was put to the sword. Robert wanted the smoke of burning farmhouses to be visible from the walls of Bruges. He wanted them to smell their doom approaching. This psychological warfare was designed to induce panic. Robert expected the coalition of Flemish cities to fracture. He anticipated that the wealthy merchants of Ghent would sell out the radicals of Bruges to save their own skins. He expected begging delegations to come crawling out with keys to the cities, pleading for mercy. He misjudged his enemy completely. Instead of fracturing, the terror forged the Flemish cities into a singular block of hardened resolve. The smoke on the horizon didn't make them want to surrender. It proved that they had nothing left to lose. The rabble did not scatter. They converged. As the French army approached the town of Courtrai, Robert of Artois surveyed the field with satisfaction. He had roughly 2,500 noble cavalry and perhaps 5,500 support infantry, including unmatched Genoese crossbowmen. He saw the Flemish positions and scoffed. They were lined up on foot, an admission of poverty in his eyes. However, Robert's confidence blinded him to the warnings of his own scouts. The terrain around Courtrai was a nightmare for cavalry. It was crisscrossed by the River Liz and a network of brooks and drainage ditches. The ground was soft, sodden with the river's overflow. For a heavy horse dependent on firm footing to deliver a charge, this was treacherous ground. Experienced tactical advisers suggested a more cautious approach. They urged Robert to use his crossbowmen to whittle the Flemish down or to starve them out. They asked, why risk noble blood against peasants? Robert dismissed them with a sneer. To wait would be cowardly. To use crossbows would be to deny the knights their glory. He wanted to crush them with a charge. He wanted the sound of breaking bones to be the last thing the rebels heard. He reportedly remarked that if the Flemish were willing to stand, he would run them down so fast the wind would not have time to dry the mud on their boots. The French camp settled in. Squires polished the armour until it gleamed like mirrors. Knights sharpened their lances and wagered on who would kill the most weavers. They checked the straps on their saddles and the shoes on their horses. They slept soundly, secure in their superiority, unaware that just across the field, thousands of men were awake, sharpening iron spikes and praying for the strength to hold the line. The lily of France had arrived, beautiful and deadly, but the mud of Flanders was waiting to swallow it whole. Across the muddy expanse of the field, the view from the French lines was one of contempt. The knights saw a dark, shapeless mass of humanity huddled against the river. They saw men in dirty tunics, lacking the heraldic brilliance of the aristocracy. To the French, this was a mob of serfs, a rabble of angry peasants holding sticks, waiting to be dispersed. This was the most dangerous optical illusion in military history. The force waiting in the mud was not a peasant uprising. It was the Flemish militia, and it represented something entirely new in medieval warfare, the weaponization of the middle class. To understand why this army did not break and run, you must understand the medieval guilds. In 1302 Flanders, a guild was not just a trade union. It was a state within a state. If you were a weaver in Bruges, the Guild of Weavers was your world. They set your wages. They inspected the quality of your cloth. They cared for your widow if you died, and they buried you when you passed. They were your government, your insurance policy, and your family. Now they were your platoon. The men standing in the shield wall were not strangers conscripted from different villages. They were co-workers. The man standing on your right was the same man who sat next to you at the loom every day for 10 years. The man on your left was your neighbour. You knew his wife's name. You knew his children. You knew he wouldn't run because if he did, he wouldn't just be deserting an army. He would be betraying his brothers. This created a level of unit cohesion that the French knights, for all their individual prowess, could never match. The French fought for personal glory. The Flemish fought for the man standing next to them. Look closely at their equipment. You won't find the custom-fitted plate armour of the nobility. Instead, you see the industrial strength of the city. These men were wealthy enough to arm themselves. They wore heavy steel helmets, known as kettle hats, that protected against downward sword strokes. They wore thick padded jackets called gambesons, capable of absorbing the blunt force of a mace, and chainmail hauberks. They carried pikes, crossbows, and axes. This was mass-produced utilitarian gear. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. The leadership structure was equally radical. While the French army was led by counts and dukes who inherited their command by blood, the Flemish were led by the demagogues of the street, men like Peter de Coninck. De Coninck was a master weaver. small in stature, blind in one eye, and possessing a tongue of fire. He was a populist leader who had rallied the working poor against both the French king and the wealthy Flemish patricians who wanted to capitulate. Beside him stood men like Jan Breedel, the leader of the Butchers' Guild, a man whose profession involved dismembering carcasses and who brought that specific skill set to the battlefield. These leaders did not sit on horses behind the lines. They stood in the front rank, shoulder to shoulder with their apprentices. The atmosphere in the Flemish camp was starkly different from the carnival across the field. There was no gambling, there was no wine flowing, there was a terrifying clarity of purpose. They knew the rules of engagement. In a typical medieval battle, if a knight was captured, he was ransomed. It was a financial transaction. But for a rebellious commoner, there was no ransom. There was only the rope or the axe. The Flemish knew they were fighting with their backs to the wall, literally. They had positioned themselves with the River Liz behind them. This was a deliberate choice. It sent a message to every man in the ranks. There is no retreat. You cannot run because you will drown. We win here or we die here. This army of guildsmen was a complex organism. The weavers formed the heavy infantry blocks. The crossbowmen from the smaller trades provided ranged support. The butchers, with their heavy cleavers and axes, acted as shock troops. They moved in silence, responding to the commands of their guild deans. The French saw a chaotic mob. Reality concealed a disciplined, desperate machine, fueled by class hatred and existential dread. But discipline alone stops a cavalry charge about as well as a prayer stops a landslide. To kill a knight, you need more than brotherhood. You need a tool designed to negate the advantages of armour and horsepower. The Flemish had such a tool. It was a weapon so crude, so brutal, and so effective that it would become the icon of the battle. It was a heavy wooden club with a steel spike, and the soldiers gave it a name that was a dark joke in itself. They called it the Goedendag. If you visit a museum in Flanders today, you might see a weapon that looks deceptively simple. It resembles a heavy walking staff, perhaps 5 feet long, thickening at the top like a baseball bat, with a sharp steel spike driving out of the centre. It lacks the elegance of a sword or the range of a spear. It looks like a tool a farmer might use to break up clods of earth. This is the Goedendag, and on July 11th, 1302, it was the most terrifying object in the world for a French knight. The name itself is a grim historical joke. Goedendag translates from Dutch as good day. Some historians argue the name comes from Goedendag, meaning good dagger, but the oral tradition suggests a darker origin, that the Flemish militia would greet their oppressors with a cheerful good day right before crushing their skulls. To understand why this stick was a night killer, we have to look at the physics of medieval armour. By 1302, knights were wearing mail hauberks, often reinforced with early plates of steel on the knees, shins and chest. A sword's slash against this defence is useless. It simply glances off. An arrow needs to hit a weak point like the eye slit or the armpit to do damage. The Goedendag solved this problem by ignoring finesse and maximising physics. It was a dual-threat weapon system designed specifically for asymmetric warfare. First, the spike. When a cavalry charge comes thundering in, the user plants the base of the staff into the mud and aims the steel point at the horse's chest. The animal's own momentum does the work. The horse impales itself, collapsing the charge and dumping the rider onto the ground. But the genius of the Goedendag appears after the horse is down. A knight on the ground is still a tank. You can't stab through his chest plate easily, but the Goedendag is top-heavy, made of dense, seasoned oak bound with an iron ring. It functions as a massive club. When you swing it with 2 hands, you generate immense kinetic energy. You don't need to penetrate the armour, you simply need to transfer the shockwave through the steel. A solid hit to a helmet with a Goedendag doesn't need to cut the metal. The concussive force travels through the helmet and into the skull, causing immediate brain hemorrhaging, concussions or neck fractures. It turns the knight's own protective shell into an echo chamber of trauma. The Flemish developed a tactical doctrine around this weapon. They didn't just give everyone a club and tell them to swing. They paired the Goedendag wielders with pikemen. The front rank held long pikes 12 to 15 feet long, creating a bristling wall of steel to stall the horses. The Goedendag men stood in the second rank. The tactical sequence was brutal and rhythmic. The pike stops the horse. The Goedendag hooks the rider or smashes the horse's legs. Once the horse, The Goedendag hooks the rider or smashes the horse's legs. Once the knight is in the mud, the militia swarms. This cooperation required nerves of steel. Standing in front of a charging destrier requires a suppression of every survival instinct a human being possesses. But remember the guilds. These men trusted each other. The pikeman knew that if he held the line, his brother with the club would finish the job. The French had no concept of this. In their minds, infantry existed to be trampled. They had never encountered a weapon designed so specifically to dismantle their advantages. They looked at the Goedendag and saw a primitive stick. They failed to see that it was an armour-piercing sledgehammer. Furthermore, the Goedendag was cheap. A sword took weeks for a master-smith to forge and cost a fortune. A Goedendag could be mass-produced by any village carpenter and blacksmith in a day. It was the democratization of violence. For the price of one French warhorse, you could equip 100 men with the means to kill the rider. As the sun climbed higher over the field of Courtrai, the Flemish militia tightened their grip on these oak shafts. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a porcupine of pikes and clubs, waiting for the ground to shake. They had the will, and they had the weapon. Now they just needed the terrain to cooperate, because even the bravest man with the biggest club cannot stop a cavalry charge on open ground. The Flemish needed an equalizer. They needed the land itself to turn traitor against the French, and that is exactly what they engineered. In military strategy, there is an ancient maxim. Amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. But there is a third tier. Geniuses talk about geography. If you look at a modern satellite map of Courtrai, or Courtrai as it is known locally, you see a bustling Belgian city. But if you strip away the modern pavement and return to July 1302, you see a landscape that was practically designed by nature to kill horses. The Flemish commanders, including the sharp-eyed Renier of Richelieu, looked at the battlefield and saw a puzzle. They had a massive problem, the open field. If they met the French on the grassy plains, the knights would simply flank them, encircle them, and cut them to pieces. They needed to funnel the French into a corridor where their numbers and speed meant nothing. They chose a position that seemed, to the untrained eye, like suicide. The Flemish army deployed in a rough crescent shape. Behind their backs roared the river Lys wide and deep. This was a violation of basic military doctrine. You never fight with a river at your back, because it leaves you no avenue for retreat. But this was calculated madness. By cutting off their own escape route, the Flemish commanders invoked what Sun Tzu called death ground. When soldiers know there is no boat coming, no bridge to cross, and that retreat means drowning, they fight with the ferocity of trapped animals, turned fear into fuel. But the real trap lay in front of them. The battlefield was dissected by the Groninger stream and a network of smaller, muddy runoffs used for agriculture. To a man walking, these were annoying ditches. To a horse carrying 300 pounds of armoured knight, they were leg breakers. The Flemish didn't just rely on the existing streams, they enhanced them. They grabbed shovels and dug. They widened the ditches. In some accounts, they covered these pits with brush and dirt, creating primitive booby traps. They flooded parts of the meadow to turn the firm soil into a sucking quagmire. They transformed the battlefield into a sponge. Think about the physics of a charge again. A cavalry charge relies on rhythm. The horses must gallop in unison to create a wall of impact. The ground must be firm to allow for the push-off. By turning the field into a muddy obstacle course, the Flemish ensured that the French line would be broken before they even made contact. A knight whose horse stumbles is no longer a warrior. He's a pile of scrap metal struggling to stand up. This was terrain tactics at its finest. The Flemish turned the topography into a silent ally. They forced the French to attack across a narrow front, bottlenecking them. This negated the French numerical advantage in cavalry. It didn't matter if Robert of Artois had 2,500 knights if only 50 could reach the front line at a time. From the French vantage point, however, these subtleties were invisible. They looked across the field and saw a flat expanse of green leading up to the Flemish lines. They didn't test the ground. They didn't send light cavalry to scout the depth of the ditches. Why would they? They were the French. The ground was expected to submit to them just as the peasants were. Robert of Artois saw the river behind the Flemish and laughed. He thought they had trapped themselves for his convenience. Look, he might have told his lieutenants, they have dug their own grave. He was half right. It was a grave. He just didn't realize who was going to fill it. The morning of July the 11th dawned hot and humid. The mist rose off the marshes, obscuring the deadly modifications the Flemish had made to the landscape. The trap was set. The kill box was ready. All that was needed was for the mouse to be arrogant enough to snap the cheese. And Robert of Artois was starving for glory. War is usually decided by who makes the fewest mistakes. On July 11th, the French didn't just make a mistake. They committed a tactical sin born of pure ego. The tragedy for the French army is that they actually started the battle correctly. Robert of Artois, despite his arrogance, knew how to deploy his combined arms. At noon, he ordered his infantry and mercenaries forward. These weren't just random foot soldiers, they were Genoese crossbowmen, the snipers of the medieval world. These mercenaries carried heavy crossbows capable of punching through mail armour from 100 yards away. They advanced towards the Flemish lines and opened fire. The air filled with the thrum of bowstrings and the hiss of bolts. The Flemish, standing in their tight formations, had nowhere to hide. They took casualties. Gaps appeared in the shield wall. The psychological strain of standing still while death rains down on you is immense. The Flemish line began to shudder. If Robert of Artois had simply sat on his horse and waited, the crossbowmen might have won the battle for him. They were softening the enemy up, breaking their cohesion, preparing them for a rout. But to the French nobility watching from the rear, this was intolerable. You have to understand the mindset of a 14th century knight. They did not view war as a pragmatic exercise in securing objectives. They viewed it as a theatre for valour. To let paid mercenaries, foreigners and commoners no less win the battle with cowardly ranged weapons was an insult to their honour. If the Flemish ran away before the knights could charge, there would be no glory. There would be no one to trample. There would be no stories to tell at court. Restlessness rippled through the cavalry lines like a virus. Horses stomped in the heat. Knights cursed the slow, methodical pace of the crossbowmen. They looked at the dirty peasants across the field and saw easy prey being stolen from them. The pressure on Robert of Artois became unbearable. His lieutenants urged him to attack. "Sir," they likely argued, "if we wait any longer, the rabbits will flee back to their burrows." So, Robert made the decision that would doom them all. He didn't just order the charge, he ordered it through his own men. He signalled the recall. The Genoese crossbowmen, confused and likely frustrated, stopped firing and began to reload and withdraw. But they couldn't move fast enough for the impatient knights. With a roar of Montjoie Saint-Denis, the battle cry of France, the heavy cavalry began to move. They didn't wait for the infantry to clear the field, they rode them down. The French knights literally trampled their own crossbowmen in their eagerness to get to the Flemish. Imagine the chaos. The Genoese are screaming, diving into the mud to avoid the iron-shod hooves of their employers. The formation of the charge is already disrupted before they have even crossed the midfield. The rhythmic, terrifying wall of horseflesh that is supposed to act as a shockwave is now a disorganized stampede stumbling over allied bodies. Across the field, the Flemish commanders must have watched this with disbelief. They saw the French discard their tactical advantage. They saw the arrows stop falling. They saw the knights voluntarily disordering their own lines. The rabbits tightened their grip on their pikes. The Goedendag men planted their feet in the soft earth. The French were coming, just as the Flemish had hoped. They were coming fast, angry, and blind to the mud that awaited them. Robert of Artois lowered his lance. He saw only the enemy. He did not see the brooks. He did not see the marsh. He definitely did not see the end of the age of chivalry rushing up to meet him. The trap was sprung. The ground began to tremble. If you have never stood in front of a heavy cavalry charge, it is difficult to comprehend the sheer acoustic violence of it. 2,500 warhorses, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, galloping in anger creates a frequency that you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears. It sounds like a landslide. It sounds like the end of the world. To the Flemish militiamen standing by the river, the horizon became a wall of steel, silk, and snorting beast. The French knights lowered their lances, aiming for the chests of the peasants. They accelerated, expecting the militia to break in terror before impact. This was the psychological weapon of the charge. Panic usually killed the infantry long before the lances did. But the Flemish did not break. They locked their shields. They grounded their pikes in the mud, angling the steel points upward at a 45-degree angle. They held their breath. Then the geography woke up. As the French front line hit top speed, they didn't collide with the Flemish. They collided with the Groninger stream. In the heat of the charge, obscured by the trampling of their own infantry and the tall summer grass, the knights didn't see the widened ditches until it was too late. The front rank plunged in. There was no graceful leap. Horses shattered their legs on the uneven banks. Riders were catapulted from their saddles, flying through the air like armoured dolls before splashing into the muck. The laws of physics are indifferent to noble titles. A charge depends on flow. The ditch stopped the flow instantly. But the knights behind didn't know that. They couldn't stop. They slammed into the rear of the fallen horses, creating a horrific metallic pile-up. It was a medieval traffic accident on a massive scale. The shock of the shot cavalry evaporated. The momentum that was their greatest asset suddenly became their cage. The majestic French charge turned into a screaming, churning mass of horseflesh and steel, trapped in a ditch that was rapidly filling with water and blood. For the knights who managed to stay mounted and bridge the ditch, a second nightmare awaited. They spurred their horses up the muddy bank, only to find themselves nose to nose with a solid wall of pikes. A horse, no matter how well trained, will rarely impale itself on a spike voluntarily. The horses shied away, reared up or stopped dead, sliding in the slick mud. The knights were now stationary targets. A stationary knight is just a man sitting on a high chair wearing a metal can. He has no reach against a 12-foot pike. He has no agility against a man on the ground. This was the moment the medieval warfare tactics flipped. The hunters became the trapped. The Flemish commanders blew their horns. The order was not to retreat, but to advance. The militia block took a step forward, then another. They began to compress the French against the ditch. The Goedendag men stepped through the gaps in the pike wall. This is where the true horror began. The French knights were packed so tightly together that they couldn't swing their swords. Their horses were belly deep in mud. They looked down to see the dirty weavers raising those heavy spiked clubs. The sound of the battle changed. It was no longer the thunder of hooves. It was the wet, crunching sound of a wood hitting steel. It was the sound of the Goedendag doing exactly what it was designed to do. The French nobility had ridden into a meat grinder, and the handle was about to be turned. In the mud of the Groninger stream, the rules of war were suspended. Usually when a knight fell, the battle paused for a brief, civilized transaction. The knight would raise his gauntlet and yield. He would offer his name and his ransom potential. The captor would protect him, seeing a bag of gold rather than an enemy. It was a business. But the men of Ghent and Bruges were not businessmen today. They were executioners. Before the battle, the Flemish commanders had issued a chilling order that violated every norm of Christendom. Take no prisoners, spare no one. They knew that if they took captives, the knights would eventually return to burn their cities. To win, they had to exterminate the class of people that threatened them. As the French knights struggled in the bog, weighed down by 60 pounds of wet steel, they raised their hands in surrender. They shouted their titles. "I am the Count of so-and-so. I can pay you 10,000 livres." The response was a Goedendag to the face. The slaughter was systematic. The Flemish militia moved through the tangled mess of horses and men like harvesters working a field. They used the hooks of their weapons to drag knights from their saddles. They used the spikes to find the gaps in the armour, the armpits, the groin, the visor. It was intimate, gruesome work. A knight in plate armour is hard to kill, so the militia had to gang up on them. 3 or 4 guildsmen would surround a fallen noble. One would pin his legs, another would pry off his helmet, and a third would finish the job. The mud turned red. The screams of men and horses merged into a single deafening dissonance. In the centre of this cauldron was Robert of Artois. The commander of the French army, the man who had laughed at the rabbits, now found himself fighting for every breath. His horse had been killed. He was on foot, surrounded by the very people he despised. Accounts vary on his final moments, but the most telling version describes him cornered, swinging his sword in desperation. He was a skilled warrior, but skill means nothing when you're swarmed. Robert reportedly cried out, "I surrender! I am the Count of Artois." He tried to offer his sword to a Flemish leader, expecting the courtesy due his rank. The Flemish soldier looked at him. He didn't see a count. He saw the man who had burned his village. He saw the man who had promised to hang his children. There was no acceptance of the sword. There was no bow of respect. Robert of Artois was beaten to the ground. They ripped the armour from his body. They stabbed him repeatedly, ensuring that the hero of France died in the same mud as the lowest conscript. His body was left unrecognisable, just another heap of meat in the pile. This was the end of chivalry, not as a concept, but as a guarantee of safety. For the first time, the nobility realised that their titles were not a force field. The psychological shock of this moment cannot be overstated. It was like a modern army watching a tank battalion being dismantled by men with screwdrivers. The massacre continued for hours. The French rear guard, seeing the slaughter of their vanguard, panicked and fled. The Flemish pursued them for miles, cutting down stragglers. By the time the sun began to set, the flower of French nobility had been effectively decapitated. Silence slowly returned to the fields of Courtrai, broken only by the groans of the dying and the splash of scavengers wading into the bloody water. The rabbits had not just survived, they had won. And now, it was time to collect their receipts. The sun set on July 11th, 1302, over a landscape that had been irrevocably altered. The green fields were churned into a black slurry of mud, blood, and trampled grass. The Groninger stream was choked with the damned corpses of the finest warhorses in Europe. But as the adrenaline faded, the practical reality of the victory began to set in for the Flemish militia. They had not just defeated an army, they had bankrupted a social class. In the medieval world, a knight was a walking treasury. His armour, his weapons, his horse, and his jewellery were worth more than a peasant village earned in a decade. And now all that wealth was lying in the mud, waiting to be claimed. The looting began immediately. It wasn't just greed, it was a pragmatic necessity. The militia needed to strip the dead to ensure they were truly dead, and to gather the resources needed for the inevitable counterattack. But amidst the swords and the coin purses, the Flemish sought one specific trophy, the Golden Spurs. The spur was the ultimate status symbol of the equestrian class. You earned your spurs when you were dubbed a knight. They represented your right to ride above the common man. To strip a knight of his spurs was the ultimate act of degradation. The Flemish didn't just take a few, they took them by the basketful. They moved from corpse to corpse, unbuckling the gilded straps from the boots of counts, barons and castellans. They found the spurs of Raoul de Nesle, the Constable of France. They found the spurs of Robert of Artois, now wiped clean of his blood. They found the spurs of Jacques de Châtillon, the hated governor who had started this entire war with his oppression. When the accounting was done, the numbers were staggering. Historians debate the exact figure, but tradition holds that the Flemish collected 500 pairs of golden spurs. That is 1,000 pieces of solid gold, stripped from the heels of the French elite. This was a demographic catastrophe for France. In a single afternoon, the kingdom lost its senior military command, its most experienced administrators, and the heads of its most powerful families. There were castles in Normandy and Burgundy that would sit empty for years, waiting for toddler heirs to come of age. The King's Council in Paris was practically dissolved because almost everyone on it was dead in a ditch in Flanders. The Flemish took these bloody trophies and did something theatrical. They didn't melt them down, for coin at least, not immediately. They marched to the Church of Our Lady in Courtrai and hung them from the rafters. Imagine walking into that church in 1302. You look up, and shimmering in the candlelight are hundreds of golden spurs clinking softly in the draught. It was a macabre wind chime. It was a monument to the impossible. It served as a grim warning to any future invader. This is what happens to those who think they can trample us. For Philip the Fair, the news of Courtrai was not just a defeat. It was a trauma